Thanks again, Fletcher and the Bryce Tech team for sort of setting the stage of the narrative that we're going to spend the rest of the day talking upon which we are going to build. In order to kick us off with that, I'm pleased to announce Cynthia Bouthot, who is president of Space Commerce Matters. We just heard from Fletcher about the as-is state of the industry, and now we're going to hear from Cynthia about what we are all going to create for the 2B of the Keystone Space Collaborative region. Thank you.
Thanks, Priscilla. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Is it the green button that moves things forward? Is the presentation? Oh, there we go. Let's see. Okay. So I love that that segue question. And what I am here to do today is to talk to you about KSC's vision to transform an as-is ecosystem of many traditional players to a 2B strategy and vision and space strategy that is really moving from a traditional supply side to a all-inclusive demand and investment side. And we're going to explain to you what that looks like, what that piece of work we've done for the board and for Justine, and what we're going to ask you to do during the breakout sessions right after this talk. So when we talk about commercialization of space, we're looking at the Earth, we're looking at the Moon and Mars, and we traditionally hear about that. There's been a traditional focus on the supply side. We all hear about what Elon Musk is doing and what Sierra Nevada is doing and Northrop and others. But what about the demand side? What about this non-traditional demand side that has had extensive commercial activity? All of those companies that we're seeing on the slide right now have done activity, research and development, and the beginnings of manufacturing in low Earth orbit. We are not talking about gimmicks and marketing. We're talking about real commercial activity, which will be the basis for transforming low Earth orbit and beyond from a supply side to an also demand side and creating a true marketplace. We are going off our planet to save our planet, and we're seeing so many initiatives around sustainability, and all of these things actually have solutions in space. One of the things, and I think this it's really an eye chart, when Justine or when Fletcher just talked about the size of the space market, what it does not include are these non-traditional demand, R&D and manufacturing activities, which my company, Space Commerce Matters, has spent the last 4 years working with organizations to specifically understand what can you do in low Earth orbit, utilizing microgravity, the extreme conditions, and the vantage point to produce superior products back here on Earth. So we're not talking about space-based activity. We're talking about using space as a new marketplace for outsourced R&D and manufacturing. We have concluded that there's over $850 billion of total addressable market opportunity on that demand side. And as I mentioned, it's not being discussed. We talk about the supply side, we don't talk about that demand side. So what is it we're doing here today? There's, NASA, the UK, the whole United Kingdom put together a new space strategy. NASA has put in place many commercialization initiatives that I think we'll be talking about today, and I think on our panel later we'll be talking about some of these, where organizations like NASA are really promoting commercialization through these initiatives. The European Space Agency is doing the same. But what we're here talking about today is what is the Keystone Space Collaborative doing in terms of driving that new vision, that new 2B vision of what this ecosystem could look like. It started with the as-is, and I'm a very simple sort of a diagram. I have a diagram mind where I look at what is the as-is, what's the 2B, what's the gap between the two, that equals our implementation plan, and that's the way that we will get to our vision. So what Fletcher just described to you earlier was really what does this as-is ecosystem look like right now? And it's actually very strong. There's lots of underpinnings of this as-is ecosystem. In terms of our 2B vision, we worked with the board to understand what are those broader outcome goals, new demand creation, fundraising, economic development. I know there's a lot of economic development folks in here, and really that's the way we think about moving this market forward. It's about new jobs, new skill sets, new business opportunity. Thought leadership. There are so many thought leaders in this room and throughout this region, and how do we capitalize on that and again punch beyond the weight of this tri-state region with the thought leadership in those particular areas of focus. Supply side growth. Just because we're really focused on the other side, developing all of these other pieces, doesn't mean the traditional supply side can't also benefit. And we're going to talk about some of those ways as well. And then advocacy. And I loved what Senator Capito was talking about in terms of it's our job to educate our political leaders on what those opportunities look like so that they don't go into a hearing and not understand what Artemis is or why would you do anything from an R&D or a manufacturing perspective in space. So again, these are the things that we're hoping as we go into the breakout groups right after this. What are some of your ideas around how we can drive new demand creation, engage these non-traditional actors in this initiative? Fundraising, and when we talk about fundraising, it was really interesting last night talking about the whole Pittsburgh background and really the philanthropic backbone of this region. Well, that's a real strength we can capitalize as a fundraising strategy as compared to other areas like Columbus, which have huge venture capital and accelerator type operations. The economic indicators, really taking things from, I don't know if you're following what's going on in countries like Luxembourg, where they have taken their legacy skills in mining and in manufacturing, and they're creating all new programs to convert that to how would you mine an asteroid or how would you manufacture in space. So there are lots of things we can do from an economic indicator and development perspective to make these transitions. I mentioned thought leadership, political and policy advocacy, and then strengthen the supply side. So this is what our vision of where we're going today. We have already conducted an as-is map of what are the types of programs and initiatives we can do. But what we'd like also is for feedback from all of you today to come together to create this growth and implementation plan that ultimately gets to a tri-state space strategy where you are considering all of these really important initiatives. And so just to sort of set the stage on this, when we looked at the as-is, and I'm not going to go into detail because Justine mentioned some of this and Fletcher did as well, each of our regions has strengths in these areas that I'm talking about: new demand, fundraising, political and policy advocacy, thought leadership. And what we've done is we've really looked at, how does Cleveland, which Mike Johansson from Zinn Technologies will be talking to us with the work he does with Glenn Research Center in Cleveland, the work that they're doing in Cleveland with regenerative medicine, as compared to Columbus, where OSU is doing quite a bit with the Battelle Center and with remote sensing activity, and looking at partnerships around that. With Dayton, it's interesting because there's lots of work around sustainability, and they have the aquifer. And what we're talking about when we go off the planet to save our planet, we could target Dayton as an example for sustainability programs tied to space solutions. And then Cincinnati having many of the Fortune 500 HQs there. So how do we go again to Procter & Gamble, who has already done prolific work in low Earth orbit, and other organizations like P&G to do additional R&D and manufacturing. With Pennsylvania, the as-is overview is equally strong. We really talk about the two poles of Pittsburgh versus Philly. With Pittsburgh, the amount of per capita research and development spending that goes on in this region is 2 or 2.5 times the national average. The philanthropic base, the endowments, the foundations, that's a way to raise new funding, third-party sponsorship for activity that can be done in low Earth orbit. There is a strong supply side, and compare that to Philly, where Philly has lots of the HQs. It has most of the VC as compared to the foundation approach. And so when you look at these profiles of how these regions stack out, you can now start to develop strategies on how to tap in to new demand, new funding, new economic development. And then with West Virginia, again, we've talked about the Katherine Johnson facility. We've talked about the big work that they're doing with NOAA. Dwayne Cecil here was just there on his way over to this conference to meet with these folks to understand, what is it that they're focused on and how can we move that to a 2B ecosystem. With West Virginia, I think it's a region that is the hungriest from an economic development perspective. There's lots of activity going on that could actually support our transition to a space-based economy. And if you read the West Virginia economic strategy, they specifically call out a parallel to Massachusetts. I'm from Boston, and early on in my days with the International Space Station National Lab, we got the Mass Life Science Center to donate $500,000 for a galactic grant challenge, which resulted in the intersection of life science and space-based activity. They specifically talk about the Mass Life Science Center in their economic strategy. Why don't we think about a similar galactic grant program in West Virginia? And so now these are my ending slides before we transition to our own breakout groups. So what is it that we mean by this 2B vision? New demand creation. Each of these companies, as I mentioned earlier, Budweiser, Goodyear, Procter & Gamble, Nalco, Champion, they have all conducted extensive R&D and manufacturing, or the beginnings of manufacturing activity in low Earth orbit. And when we look at the strengths of the tri-state region, the advanced manufacturing, the AI and robotics, the agriculture and nutrition, the food processing, the automotive, each one of those are very strong and have a big parallel to why you would ever do anything from a research, development, or manufacturing perspective in low Earth orbit. It's those effects of less defects in your material, or creating a drug and creating a crystal that you cannot crystallize here on Earth, but you can do it up in space. And so it's those propositions that we can go and work with